25th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting. My name is Chris Ramey and I'm the chair of the Eugene Planning Commission. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using in response to Governor Brown's Stay Home, Save Lives order. This format allows the Planning Commission to meet, hear from the community, and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and the public safe. Today, our meeting will begin with public comment, followed by a work session on the Middle Housing Code amendments. There are several housekeeping announcements and instructions related to the meeting format that I need to take care of first. Thank you for your patience while I work my way through them. Anyone wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by following the access instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. For those who join the meeting via computer, device, or phone, your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. If you wish to participate during the public comment portion of the meeting and haven't already done so, please raise your virtual hand now to join the speaker's queue in one of two ways. For those viewing the meeting on a computer, laptop, or other device, click once on the hand icon. For those listening to the meeting on a phone, press *9. When the public comment begins, our moderator will announce the next two speakers at a time. When it's your turn, the moderator will announce your name and unmute your microphone. Public comment is limited to 10 minutes, so your time to speak will be based on the number of people signed up to speak. Finally, I want to thank everyone for their patience, flexibility, and good humor as we work within this new virtual meeting format. As always, feel free to contact staff if there is testimony you were not able to provide or wish to get to us in a different manner. So I can see that there are no attendees. We are only panelists. And unless there is someone on the phone, I am going to predict that we will not have anyone for public comment. So nobody on the phone, I take it?
We don't have anybody.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Well, that finishes our public comment item for the evening. And now we will move on to item B, a work session on Middle Housing Code amendments with Terry Harding.
Thanks, Commissioner Ramey. Yeah, and I just wanted to acknowledge that River is here. River, I'm going to start the presentation and then pause when it'll be your turn to talk. So it'll be a couple slides in. We also have other staff on the line today. Sophie, Jeff, Jen, and Rob Innerfeld from Transportation Planning are all here to help answer questions. And then we'll have Matt Hasty joining us right at 6 o'clock sharp. He's double booked tonight with another community that he's helping. So we'll have Matt joining us about 6 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Are you seeing the ones without my notes, hopefully? Okay, great. Good evening. So tonight we are going to continue the meeting that we had last week on the straw poll for middle housing. We're going to do a quick introduction to the project, and then we'll have some perspectives from River, who is a member of our Equity Roundtable. And then we'll dive into the code recommendation items, straw poll items 8 through 13 that we didn't get to last time. And then we're going to wrap up with follow-up items on two things that you discussed at the last meeting, having to do with the middle housing approach to parking and the approach to incentivizing middle housing, either near transit or citywide. So that should be a good discussion. As a reminder, the overall goals of the middle housing project are to comply with the House bill, further ongoing work aimed at addressing equity and affordability, and enable more production of diverse types of housing across Eugene. Okay, so we've been doing this for every Planning Commission meeting, and I think it's been so awesome to hear from folks who have been a part of one of our roundtables or our Healthy Democracy panel. So today we're going to hear from River, who has been serving on the Equity Roundtable, and I'll stop sharing so that we can all look at each other. Go ahead, River.
Hi, everyone. So I'm River, and I use they, them pronouns. I'm here representing Transponder and our trans community. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So yeah, it's been an honor to be part of the Equity Roundtable, and I've been learning quite a lot myself, and was asked to come and just present a bit of my perspective from the community that I'm representing for your all's work. So, the three biggest things, I guess, that are important to share for you all is one is about accessibility. And when I think about that for trans and gender diverse folks, I think about typically our financial picture and what we look like when we come and apply for housing. Employment discrimination, housing discrimination, all of the different, compounding factors that happen in our life, that we are not an ideal candidate for a loan. And so when we think about these kinds of projects and increasing equity and accessibility, that's a piece to be considered. What sort of community partners can we do work with? How can we address that? There might be folks who have stable income now and can afford a house now, but their profile is going to look less than ideal, and it's because of discrimination mostly. So that's one piece. Another is that typically our families are non-traditional. We often have families of choice, and it often involves more than just two adults. And so there might be multiple folks who are trying to move into a house together because they are a family unit. But that might not look like, two married people applying to own a home together. And so addressing that would also increase equity. The other piece that most of the folks in my community are going to be thinking about, and I would hate to be in your shoes if I was trying to solve it, is speaking about safety, right? So they're going to be having questions. We're going to be having questions about, who are these neighbors? I know a lot of the pictures we looked at, there was kind of multiple homes in a little area. And it's one thing if we're going in and renting a place, if you go in and you find out actually, oh, it's not actually a very safe neighborhood, well, you move, hopefully, right? But if you've bought a home, that's very different. So creating some sort of process that lets people figure that out for themselves, or as an advocate, something, working on that so that people have some information about that before they buy is going to be really important. And those are probably the biggest points for our community, honestly. And I know I have 10 minutes, but I thought, I also wonder if folks have questions. Sometimes that's ultimately more helpful than what I would just say. So.
Well, River, thank you for joining us, taking time out of your evening today, and also for the time you've spent with the equity panel. We've really learned a lot from your panel, and especially people like you in the community who are willing to come forward and work on this issue and talk about it in ways that we need to hear that we wouldn't have known otherwise. And so with that, what I think maybe you mentioned the two barriers to housing for you would be, I think you said affordability, and then the sort of safety of the neighborhood. Did I get that right? Or did I get at least one of them right?
Yeah, affordability, but also safety, and that our profile as somebody who's applying for a mortgage is not going to look necessarily ideal, right? Yeah. The other piece is that it's going to look non-traditional, that there's going to be families who are, not legal families, but families of choice applying for housing together. Mm-hmm.
Commissioners, did anyone else have questions for River? Well, again, thank you for joining us this evening.
You're so welcome. Yeah, thank you for the good work you're doing.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right.
Thanks, River.
Yep. All right. I'll leave you to your meeting. Thanks.
I'm so sad the Equity Roundtable is done. it has been really, really an honor to be in those meetings. So huge kudos and thanks to River and everybody else who participated in those. And we'll go back to sharing my slideshow. Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off at the last meeting, which is in the middle of our land use code recommendations. You had attached to your packet last week a kind of cheat sheet with 13 code items, and it summarized the project team recommendation for the item, a kind of shorthand description, some reference material, and then all the commissioners' names. And we kind of worked our way through a straw poll discussion of whether each commissioner agreed with the project team recommendation or wanted to record something else. And after giving that a try last time, I think it was moderately successful. We definitely got a lot of feedback from your discussion that is helping us to finish the code language recommendations themselves. And those will be coming forward to you at your June 14th meeting. So our process today will be to finish, to pick up with number 8, go through number 13, and then, like I mentioned before, circle back to parking and incentivization. Are there any questions before we start talking about row houses? Any process questions or reference questions? Yeah, Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, so on this one, on the Rowhouse one, you know, number 8 is the generic high level thing, but then we're digging down in and on 9, 10, 11. So I just don't know how to give input on 8 when when the things that I'm having input on are going to be further down. So I don't know if I can feel comfortable saying, yes, I am all for 8 when 9 and 10 and 11 are going to impact what 8 does. So just a question there. How do you see us dealing with it?
Yeah, so maybe what I would suggest is I'll just flip through so you know what 8 through 13 are. And I think you're right. The richness of the discussion last time came from kind of these ideas around, should we incentivize near transit or citywide? And those kind of flow across the numbered items. So it's hard to say yes to this or no to this one when we have more nuanced input. I still think it's worth doing because we're keeping track of these votes and trying to keep a record of the commission's discussion. We're taking detailed notes. And then as we move forward, we'll be able to reference back to this. So even if you're a maybe, for the sake of moving the discussion along, that would help us as we get to the more detailed conversations. So I don't know if that will help you, Commissioner Borowski, but just so we see what the next ones are, we've got a row houses item, which is pretty general, a row house density and lot size question, which is more specific, a lot coverage question, and this one does come back up when we circle back around to the incentivize option, a design standards general approach question, approach to special area zones, and approach to affordability strategies. So those are the ones that we're looking for kind of high level input on. And then we'll move into some detailed discussion about parking. And we have Rob here to help support this conversation. And a detailed discussion of what does it mean to incentivize near transit or citywide across a bunch of development standards. So sorry to make anybody dizzy as I go back here to number 8, and I see Commissioner Beeson has his hand up.
So if I can give you some feedback on 8. I understand everything you said. I see how they're all kind of tying together, and some of this we'll probably touch on a couple of times or in a little more detail. I guess for number 8, I definitely agree with the project team recommendation. And I would also say, in where you say incentivizing your transit, I agree. Encourage elsewhere. I guess a point I want to make, and I may make it a couple of times in the next 2 hours. I think on a number of these different standards with respect to parking, height, lot size, some of those, I'm wanting to consider incentivizing or consider going a little further. And I know you have slides that begin to touch on that and so on, but so I would, I support this, and I would also support going beyond encourage. Let me say it another way real quickly. I support incentivizing near transit, and I would like to look at doing some of the same things you're doing near transit, doing it in all zones. Let me say it that way. Thanks.
That makes perfect sense to me.
Thank you. It does.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, we're jumping in, not seeing any other questions or concerns. So I might just hop to Commissioner Borowski and ask if you agree with what Commissioner Beeson just said, or if you have a different thing you'd like us to record.
I'm just going to go on a maybe on this one until we dig down into some of the specifics.
Sounds good. Commissioner Edwards.
Thanks, Terry. I had a question just regarding, so we're talking about the incentivize, and I know you have the kind of the recommendations of what incentivize would be on all of these different things. And we've all kind of, for the most part, articulated that we'd like to incentivize not just along transit corridors. And I've been thinking a lot about that and kind of like why transit-oriented development is even a thing. And obviously, you know, I had a question about additional density specific to transit corridors that could be incorporated into this. That is, you know, we'd still be looking at incentivizing in all of the areas, but actually in those, you know, that radius from those frequent transit network roadways to actually look at, you know, additional densities. And I don't know, we haven't really fleshed that out, but I like the idea of incentivizing everywhere, but there is actually a reason, and I'm actually now understanding that we would want to identify transit corridors as being the primary place where we want to see the density. And it's not just because the housing is appropriate for the folks that, you know, that don't want to drive around in cars and all of those reasons. But at the same time, it also provides the available housing stock that people are able to purchase. And that is what is lacking oftentimes in you know, the corridor areas. It's where we have a lot of density, a lot of multifamily, but the opportunity for somebody to buy something in the neighborhood that they currently live in is just simply not there. And so for me, I actually really appreciate that component. I don't know if that's a thing. I don't know if there is an additional incentive that could be above and beyond that speaks to density. But I'd be interested in anything that you all have kind of like flushed through as staff, or any ideas you might have.
Thank you for that. I think at this point in the conversation where we're doing straw polls and trying to get a sense of what the commission wants to see in the code, I would summarize the input you just gave as incentivize everywhere, add a density bonus near transit. And this is something that has come up in several of the outreach groups, including the developer focus group and one of the roundtables. I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but the idea of a density bonus is something that Portland has looked at. We've discussed it at a commission meeting. We talked about it with Tyler from Equa Northwest, and we have some more information about that, but we don't yet have a project team recommendation on it. So it's helpful to me and to the rest of the project team to hear what you just articulated. And my kind of shorthand for that would be that you're interested in incentivizing everywhere and adding a density bonus near transit, which for the sake of this conversation, we're talking about near transit being within a quarter mile of frequent transit routes as established by LTD. Is that accurate?
Yes,
Okay.
that is accurate because, and I'll just tack on that we talked about this at the last meeting and having those incentives be somewhat related to parking requirements and sort of like, okay, I want to, incentivize everywhere, and then additional incentives related to parking. And as I'm kind of thinking this out loud, and what I'm feeling like I would like to see is, yes, that, but also the density incentives would be nice. I'm speaking for myself, but I've now put it out there. So thank you.
Great. And we'll talk much more about parking as we get to that specific issue. Great. Okay, so skipping Commissioner Fragola, we'll go on to Commissioner Isaacson.
I'm fine with these. I'm just curious. In the packet, it describes that these are actually, I mean, if the idea is to increase the density, is the problem with them being in the South University area are something other than density? Because they're not allowed in South University District.
Oh, there are currently some prohibitions in a few neighborhoods around the university that were referenced in one of the memos. But the recommendations are to treat the middle housing code the same everywhere. And so those prohibitions would not exist anymore after this project is complete.
Got it. Then I'm in favor.
Okay, great. Okay, now I've covered up my list. Commissioner Ramey. Hi, Matt. Matt's here. Hi, Matt.
Thank you. Hey, Matt. Matt got here early too.
Yeah, good job.
I ditched my people and sisters so I could join you.
Oh.
No, I pushed them real hard and I got them done 25 minutes early, and then I made it here.
No such guarantees here, Matt. Sorry.
Hey, one out of two ain't bad.
We're the demanding child, or whatever the right analogy is. Yes, I think I'm sorting through these as we go. Commissioner Edwards brought up some interesting points. One of the concerns was we might actually be mistakenly downsizing some of these if we allowed them in places that are already R4 and they couldn't go to as high as they could go. So that occurred to me at the last time around. I don't know that that's a real concern or not. No, okay. So that would be one concern.
Right. I would just real quick on that one. I would say no, because current multifamily zoning or commercial zoning allows a much higher density, typically along the corridor.
Right. So the way it worked for me was that there's a lot of R stuff along the corridor that isn't fully built out now, that this would allow it to become, and it would not compete with those other zones. And then you begin to separate the two. You're really about flavors of what you're putting near the transit corridor, and that seems really good. And then you're sort of mentioned broadly of development incentives. So yes to incentive everywhere. And then the idea being that near the corridors, we would add additional incentives. And until I know what those incentives are, we talked about parking. I don't know if we're talking about additional units or additional height, but you know what I'm going to say next is that I would certainly want those to be tied to the idea that some of those units are actually affordable. So there was some kind of trade-off we were getting here. I'm not sure what the mechanism is for that yet, but I'm just not sure how many tools are in our toolbox there when we talk about the additional development incentives.
Great. Matt, did you want to say something?
I was just going to note that if you kind of go through the table for row houses in the memo, the things that we talk about incentivizing near transit are density / lot size, parking, and frontage. Those are the things in the initial staff recommendation, and everything else, and maybe height. But I think what we heard from you all previously was height. Let that incentivize everywhere, basically. So I think we've been. So anyway, the other things were more along the encourage line, everywhere. So if that helps, and we will talk about all those in more detail as we move through this, Terry mentioned earlier.
I woch just add one thing to that, and that is that Tiffany's suggestion of a density bonus, which Commissioner Edwards and Commissioner Ramey added on to talk about tying it to affordability, is something that is not yet fleshed out in terms of a staff recommendation. It has been brought up, but an additional density bonus in terms of additional units, this is what they do in Portland, tied to affordable rents, is something that we have thought about and discussed, but haven't come up with a recommendation yet. But this discussion is helpful in getting us to that by your next meeting. That make sense?
Well, sure. Does that mean if I keep mentioning it every time, it'll push it up the list?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if a majority of commissioners are interested in that, then we will take that as your direction and come back with a way to make it work in the code. Great. Okay. I think we finished number 8, Matt. I think we did it. We did row houses, got some general input, and we're going to go on. I can only see 5 of you, but hopefully nobody has their hand up. To row house density and lot size. We're moving right along to the next one. This one has to do actually with what we were just talking about in terms of lot size for row houses. So are there general questions about this one, or we can start at the bottom with Commissioner Ramey on this one?
Yeah, so this sounds like what we were just talking about. So that we're good. I'm good with this. Yes.
And then moving up to Commissioner Isaacson.
I'm fine with it.
Commissioner Edwards.
Yes.
This is going to be record time for this one. Commissioner Beeson.
I don't know if it'll be record or not.
I knew you jinxed us on that, Terry.
I totally did.
Well, first off, I agree. I'm agreeing with the recommendation. I'm going to pretty much agree right straight through. When it says encourage elsewhere, and I was trying to go through my notes, row houses, when you get to density and lot size, there's a lot of verbiage in there about potentially considering smaller lots, right, than what might be in the OAR.
Yes.
Do I have that right? I can't remember what it is. I bet they're smaller. So I guess what I'm not having the right notes here. I think what I'd say is I agree, incentivize near transit. And if we could, I'd be open to considering using similar lot sizes elsewhere. So incentivize elsewhere the same way. And I think it flows through a lot of this for me as I look at it, whether it's lot size or building height or and so on. I find myself wondering what sort of issue there would be with doing some of those things out in the all zones. And this might be a good example of it. So am I making any sense, Terry?
Yes.
Okay.
And
Go ahead.
If I could try to summarize, I think you're agreeing with what Commissioner Edwards said on the last slide, which was you support incentivizing near transit and possibly elsewhere. I guess it's a little different than what she said. But
yeah, that is.
Okay.
And we can, anyway, so we'll go ahead. I think we'll continue on.
Okay, awesome. Then Commissioner Borowski.
All right, thank you. So the way I'm reading the memo from the 26th is there are 3 options to encourage or incentivize. One was, and it had to do with the lot size, dropping it down to 1125 square feet per unit. And that had some density problems, because if you drop it down to 1125 per unit, that goes to 39 units per acre. So this is where, again, you're asking, are we okay to incentivize? But then on the memo where you were asking us what encourage or incentivize meant, there were 3 options that you were asking us for. So which option are you saying we're going with? And to that point, I think that maybe we go to 1125 along transit corridors, which would be the highest density, and then go back to the 1,500 square foot city-wise, which would be less than what it is now. So it's more towards encourage. It's a little bit of an incentivize, but it's not 39 units per acre that you would get at 1125. So I guess the question is, are you asking us, do we want option 1, option 2, or option 3 in this recommendation?
Matt, do you have it in front of you?
I do. And,
Okay.
and I will say this one is pretty confusing in terms of what we wrote, in terms of how many options there are. You're right, Commissioner Borowski, there's sort of 3 options within the encourage. And I'll kind of say a little bit more about the issues here. So one is that you've got some pretty high allowable densities in the R2, R3, and R4 zones, particularly R3 and R4. In the R3 and R4 zones, your allowable densities are greater than what you would end up with the 1,125 square feet per lot size. That's, as you noted, that's 39 units per acre. But in those higher density zones, you allow for even higher densities. And so that's why you might want to just exempt row houses from maximum densities. Well, it's a question of, do you allow lot area to control or density to control? And in which zones do you do that? So I think the incentivized option says exempt row houses from max density in all the R zones. So you just kind of let them get built the way they can fit and meet all the other development requirements, and don't worry about really the density or lot size requirements in those areas in near transit. Elsewhere, you could say, okay, maximum lot or minimum lot area is 1,125 square feet in the R1, which would still be higher than your current allowed density in the R1 zone. And then in terms of the R2 to R4, you would basically control by density, I think.
No, number of units.
Yeah, number of units. You just limit the number of units in a given row house development, but you'd exempt the row houses from max density and allow minimum lot size to control. That's R1. R2 is just, this is where I think it's confusing what we wrote. Same options as R1. I mean, I think again, R2 to R4, you've got high enough densities already in there that you let the densities control, not worry about the minimum lot size so much in those zones. And really the only question is, what do you do in R1? You know, do you allow, do you want to reduce the lot size to 1,125 square feet and exempt them from the minimum density or the current maximum density in that zone, that base zone? Or do you want to retain a lower maximum density? I mean, I think that's really the question. And if you agree with kind of let it ride near transit, then we're just kind of worried about elsewhere. Hopefully that was less confusing than what the table says.
It is a little bit less confusing, but again, we're throwing it out a little bit. If we're at 39 units per acre, that's still higher than what's allowed in R2. R2 is 28. That's not necessarily right. So
yes,
for me, I think we've got to pick. Are we going to go with density or are we going to go with lot size? And we can achieve the same goal both ways, right? For me, I think lot size is the one that makes the most sense, because we can say lot size of 1125, which could be a significant number of density. It could be 39 units per acre. Use that along transit corridors. And then citywide, it's still encouraging if we go to 1,500 square feet, which would get you at what, 25 units per acre, which is 10 units above, 11 units above what's allowed in R1 right now. Am I right?
Yeah, and so what you just described, are you just talking about R1 or are you talking about R1 and R2?
R2 is at 28 density max. I mean, R2 we could also go with the 1125 maybe.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm trying to get. You guys are going to have to start writing code, and the input we gave you isn't going to get you to that code unless you're making the decision on whether it's lot size or density. And I guess, do you want staff to have that decision making, or do you want it to come from the commission?
I think we'd love to get your input on it, on that question.
Okay. So for me, I would lean towards lot size as the best tool to get us to the desires that we want.
And again,
and it's not, sorry about this, Terry, but it was not the record one that you thought of.
That's okay.
And again, is that just to clarify, is that for R1 and R2? Because R3 and R4 right now, you allow higher densities and lower lot sizes. So
yeah, for me, that's the way it works. It would be
okay.
R1 and R2.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got enough recorded in my notes and others, hopefully. But now we have questions from Commissioner Beeson and Ramey. Go ahead, Commissioner Beeson.
Okay, and I'll try to be concise. I'm on the Rowhouse. I want one other bite at the apple here. I would support reducing the minimum lot sizes. And I was thinking mostly of R1, given that it's like 95% of all of our residentially zoned land. I guess I would support it in R2 also as I listened to the discussion. So, and I think as I read the notes, I would think it's okay to exceed the administrative rule max that you were noting in there, the maximum of the 25 units per acre. So I think more density would be okay. I tried to read all that in conjunction with the Echo Northwest memo that also came to us a couple of weeks ago. And they made a pretty strong point in there on that row houses happen to be that one. If you could build some more, that there was more possibility of getting more affordable owner occupied construction out there. And so I think if you kind of couple that all together, it felt pretty good to me that we would be encouraging it throughout the community to get more affordable construction of row houses. So that's my input.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Ramey.
So I see the reference to test fit on some note here somewhere. And I'm wondering about that with regard to the smaller lot sizes, because my memory from the Echo Northwest thing was that when we were getting smaller lot sizes, we were getting smaller units, and those were then more affordable. So sorry, Terry, back to affordability. But so I definitely would want to go to the smaller lot sizes if that drew a line to the smaller units and in townhouses, row houses especially. So I think staying with lot sizes works for me rather than dwelling units per acre, with the understanding that there's some relationship between the size of the units and the size of the lot, which is what I thought I got from the Echo Northwest thing.
I think that's all true. Their analysis was oriented more towards plexes than row houses. What they said about row houses, but they did say what you said about row houses, which is that those are going to be one of the more financially feasible and attractive ownership options. And one of the things that developers, frankly, are more likely to build than kind of almost anything else, and that is going to increase ownership options. And yes, there is definitely a relationship between unit size and lot size and cost, at least construction cost.
Thank you all. This is really great input for the team. And I'm gonna move us on to number 10, I think. Okay, awesome. So with this one, as we've been talking a lot about how to incentivize middle housing citywide, lot coverage came up a lot, so we will revisit this one. So it's a little awkward to do a vote on this one, but I think what I would encourage is just letting each commissioner kind of express where they fall in terms of lot coverage generally, and whether that's allow, encourage, or incentivize as explained in the memo. That's what I would suggest for this one. And maybe starting with Commissioner Borowski. You don't have to go first every time, I promise.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So I'm reading it maximum, we're looking for maximum lot coverage here, is that right? Or
Yes.
minimum?
Maximum.
So maximum lot coverage on R1 through R4 is 75%, and you're recommending no change. Is that correct?
It's 50% currently. And our initial recommendation, which was a little while back, was to essentially retain that. I think, as Terry said, we've had kind of more discussion, more of the work was done on the test fit since then. Part of what I think that showed was there would potentially be some value in increasing the lot coverage in terms of being able to accommodate some smaller units in some areas. And it really ends up being kind of a trade-off between the remaining kind of open space on the lot versus area occupied by buildings. And if you increase the lot coverage, you actually potentially get some larger units when you're looking at plexes in particular. And that's where we were particularly, where we actually care about lot size, because that's where we deal with it in the code. Is really just for the plexes, triplex, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. We can't regulate lot coverage on cottage clusters, and it is a higher percent and doesn't make a lot of sense to do much with it in townhouse and row houses. So it's really about the plexes on lot coverage. And we will show you some specific standards in one of the subsequent slides on this, which is why, as Terry said, like generally, I think the question is, do we want to allow higher lot coverage than what the current 50% is everywhere, or just near transit, or not anywhere? Keep it at 50% everywhere.
Okay, so for me, and we're just talking row houses in number 10, right, Terry?
No, it's all.
No, it's all.
This is in general.
Okay, well, because I mean, for me, the plexes and stuff are different, especially if we just did row houses and we said we're going to do a 1125 lot. That's going to be a skinny lot. You're going to want it to go deeper, right? So on lot coverages, for me, in that case on plexes, I think it would be better to have a higher maximum or a lower minimum lot coverage. But I didn't realize that this was for everything. I thought we were still on row houses, so I'm going to pass.
Okay, that's fine. Commissioner Edwards has her hand up. Go ahead.
I actually was going to bring up the same thing. I thought we were still on row houses because I'm reading on page 34 of the packet from April 26th that the current standards 75% for row houses. So that clarified that question. But I see a correlation between parking requirements and lot coverage. If there are fewer parking requirements because it's closer to transit or whatever, there is less requirement for parking lots and parking spaces and things like that. That is clearly driveways, all of that. So I guess, is there a way to tie those together and have that be specified in near transit corridors, having the minimum lot coverage be, adjusted, or does it have to be just kind of everywhere the same?
No, it doesn't have to be the same everywhere. In fact, when we get to that discussion about incentivize everywhere or versus transit, you'll see the incentivize kind of code package had tried to get at that inner relationship between some of the different standards. Did you want to add anything, Matt?
No, that's what I would have said. That having the thing that'll keep you from getting much above 50% for plexes, for instance, is whether you require parking for them. Exactly what you said. And Rowhouse is kind of the same thing. I mean, and often parking for them is some kind of tuck under parking anyway. And so you can get to a higher lot coverage in those cases too. If you require less parking, or even if one space per unit, but it's in the unit. So
I think that the question on this one is really the tension between open space and parking and building space. So we heard kind of building flexibility, advocates for building flexibility from the developer focus group a lot. And from some of the other focus groups and roundtables, we heard about placing value on open space and making sure that people still have access to that. So I think it is a trade-off, and probably deserves a nuanced approach that we're going to get into in the next couple of slides. I'm having a little bit of difficulty with this awkwardness of this one because it does differ by housing type. So
Okay. That's my feedback. I want to see something that accommodates based on its physical location. So thank you.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And I think, again, we're tracking these comments as we go, and we're kind of circling around the detailed conversation later. So let's see, we heard from John. How about Commissioner Beeson?
So I'm on this one. I had kind of started on a Rowhouse track, but I'm tracking now. We're looking kind of at all of them. I'm okay with the project team recommendation that we go with the minimum standard at 50%. I noticed that I think the project team recommendation on row houses was 75% for this one. If I read the notes right, it's 50% on duplex, triplex, and quads. And I guess I want to echo what I think Commissioner Edwards was getting at. I think when we get down to parking, I've got more to say. To the extent we began to do something with parking where we're reducing the minimum, and it begins to come back and have some impact on this. There was a chance of looking at the maximum lot coverage, turning it up a bit, making it a bit greater than 50%. But I think I'm okay with what you have as a recommendation for now.
Okay. How about Commissioner Isaacson?
I'm with Commissioner Edwards. I think that it's closer that we get to the high transit, mass transit areas, the lot adjustment can kind of go down. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but I'm on board.
Great. Commissioner Ramey.
So it seems like you have to treat them differently depending on what we're talking about. I mean, the row houses certainly could have, and honestly, the English that we're using is really confusing me. So we're talking about the minimum, maximum, and sorry. So the maximum coverage is 50%, which is the minimum standard or something. Anyway, that's where I'm starting to be losing my mind about this one. So and 50% is the standard throughout R1 currently. Is that right?
Right.
So we were going to put more units on the land and cover this, but still leave it at 50%.
And again, that's for plexes. Townhomes at 75%. That's
right. So townhomes, I guess this is all a really long argument for, well, it depends. And then when you throw in the parking requirements as we move closer to transit, if we're reducing parking, then the coverage could go up because we don't need to hold, or maybe the opposite is true. So this is kind of where I'm interested, because parking, as much as we all love it, it does create an access to sky and air. That parking space holds that access, even though there's a car there. You can still see the sky and there's more air coming in than there would be if there was a 35-foot building there. So there is some density benefit, some clear air, clear sky benefit to reserving spaces for parking. Not that I would argue for that, but that's the reality of it. So having said all that, Terry, I think you're on the right track. I think you could go to greater coverage in the townhome situation, perhaps greater near transit, and I would want to see the test fit a little bit more to understand where we are with the plexes. But I think it sounds like you're beginning to think about that. So I like what I'm hearing.
Great. Thank you. That one was super awkward. Comment on this one, Commissioner Brodsky?
Yeah, it seems to me that when we went through these other ones, I recall talking about minimum lot standards, and we had talked about 60% on some of the plexes, I thought. Does anybody else recall that? I think Commissioner Taylor brought those up when we were going through the individual plexes. I thought we had already talked about raising the lot coverage higher than 50%.
Yeah, you had a discussion about that we're bringing back to you at the end of tonight's discussion, which is why this is so awkward. But we had already kind of laid out this methodology of going through 13 items. So I'm okay with just moving on. I think we have enough discussion to get us the input that we need to bring you a recommendation for your next meeting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think we can move on to, let's see, did I do it? Yes, design standards. So again, this is a general approach to design standards. It's the basic recommendation from the project team is to use the allow approach because of the work that went into developing design standards for the model code. And Matt can go into more of that detail if you would like.
Yes, I will go into just a little more detail. So the model code has a pretty limited set of design standards. It sort of addresses three things: entry orientation, and essentially requires that there's at least one entrance that either faces the street, is at a 45-degree angle to that, or faces a common open space. There's a window coverage requirement, max 15% for street-facing facades. And then there are some requirements related to garages and off-street parking areas, as well as driveway approaches. And they're all pretty basic, I would say. And so because there are such a limited number of design standards embedded in the model code, and if you want to apply any other design standards to middle housing, you're going to have to go the alternative standards route. We recommend just sticking with the model code and not further eliminating or relaxing these particular standards. And so this was one case where, rather than the encourage or incentivize approach, we recommended the allow approach, which is essentially to incorporate the model code standards. And this is pretty much common across plexes and row houses. It's essentially the same types of standards. Cottage clusters have their whole own set of design standards. So in this case, although there too, in a lot of cases, we're recommending kind of going with what's in the model code, because again, it's pretty straightforward. You might not want to take too many of those things away. So that's kind of where we were coming from on this one.
Sorry, I moved around. I couldn't find my button. Commissioner Edwards, go ahead.
Thanks, Terry. Just a question. Would you say, Matt, that these design standards are consistent with current design standards that are applied to these types of units where they would be allowed, or are they more or less restrictive? I'm just looking for some consistency. I would support your recommendation, but I just want to confirm that there's some consistency with what we currently have.
I see Jeff is coming to save my bacon on this one.
Yeah, so thank you, Commissioner Edwards. That's a good question. So right now, as a reminder, for anything 3 or more units on a lot, we apply the multifamily standards, which are a much more robust set of standards because they're intended or they really guide development towards garden style large apartment complexes. So some of they have similar standards like building orientation, window coverage, and those types of things, but they also have a much more robust set of standards around parking in between buildings and pedestrian connections and things like that. So yes, we do have similar standards, but there are a lot more because it's intended to capture all multifamily.
Yeah. Okay, I would definitely support the staff recommendation to go with the basic standards. So, thank you.
Okay, I'll take that as a yes and move on to Commissioner Isaacson.
I believe Commissioner Borowski brought this up last time, but I don't know if it's appropriate for this or maybe we're already past it in the previous one, about how we would have a discussion of the second level joining out for row houses and going up. So I was wondering if that would qualify under design standards, or would that be a different area? And have you thought about how that would interact with the code?
I think you're talking about setbacks. We started to have a conversation about whether to reduce the front setback for row houses or other types. So it's separate from design standards.
So this would be the second level, though, so the second level and above.
No, the design standards would apply to the whole building.
Okay.
And the issue of whether something can kind of go out over the sidewalk is a setback issue.
Okay. Then I'm fine with design standards.
Okay, great. Commissioner Ramey.
So Matt, if I heard you say it right, the design standards, we can make them more restrictive, but we can't make them less restrictive, or is the other way around?
Other way around. That's why
we can make them less restrictive, but not more restrictive.
Exactly.
Okay, so
yeah,
that's fine. So again, language. Then from the developer, designer, builder roundtable, I think they raised some issues about some of these having to do with doors and things. So, but I just want to be clear if there's some way to understand which of the things they brought up we could actually do and which ones we can't, without getting into this other long process. Just so as we go through this, we heard you and here's what we decided. But otherwise, if I think what your advice to us, to team's advice, I can accept. I like it.
Okay. The one thing I would say about some of the feedback we got from the developers focus group is that they were arguing for flexibility, especially with regards to entrance orientation and things like that when you have a lot that faces a busy street and some of those things. But my understanding of the design standards that are in the model code is there are options and you are allowed to face a porch or face at an angle. And some of the things that they were asking for flexibility on, I believe are included, but Matt, please correct me if I'm wrong.
I think that's true because, for instance, with entry orientation, there's sort of three options in the model code. One is face the street, one is be at an angle, third is face in a common courtyard area. And so I think, one of the comments from the developers roundtable was there's no compelling reason why you have to face the street if the entrances to the places are within a common kind of open space or courtyard or parking area, you could face that. And so I think the model code would allow for that option. So I think it would be okay. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's go to Commissioner Beeson.
I'm okay with the recommendation to use the model code for the basic design standards. The only other thing I'd add to the discussion as I listen, I think just as we put it all together in the final code, I just would want to be sure we're not bringing forth any design standards that are going to, put anybody I don't want to see units or them building anything that would become less affordable because we're adding more onerous design standards, or they all look pretty generic to me, or as I've listened to the discussion. So I think the model code standards are fine.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just quickly note that when we were working on the model code, Echo Northwest was on our team there as well. We queried them about, hey, are these things that are going to add any kind of significant cost? They basically said no. You know, that's why we're not recommending going sort of below them, of doing something, kind of getting rid of some of these. It's just such a small list. So.
Okay, finally, Commissioner Borowski.
Okay, so for me, I do have some suggestions as far as design standards, and I'm thinking row houses here. There was an encourage to allow up to 10 row houses per grouping as opposed to 4 per grouping. I don't know if 10 is the right number, but I know if you limit it to 4 and there's room for 6 on a lot, you're gonna only get 4. And as you expand out in building, if you're putting 4 units together, 6 units together, 8 units together, the cost for construction goes down, which means more affordability. So initially you had encouraged go to 10 row houses per grouping. Perhaps that's something along transit corridors or something like that. But I think that by saying you have to have 4 per grouping, if you've got a large lot, you're going to have 4 per grouping, and then you have to build exterior walls, and then you've got 4 per grouping, and then you got to build exterior walls. So I would like to see that looked into a little bit more if it is the will of the commission. And then the other thing on that same thing, and you may have gotten to this, Matt, we might have gotten there, but if you've got a long skinny lot and you want to put row houses on them, having it have to be articulated to the street or on an angle, as long as you could have the main driveway be that open space, you know, so if you could drive down a driveway and go into 4 units type of deal, and that first unit on the street, if it's a narrow lot, may not necessarily be front facing. Would that be available with your scenario?
I think it would. I think the answer is yes. Take a closer look, but I'm pretty sure yes. And thanks for bringing up the issue of the number of row houses per grouping. That is one of the things we listed in the table related to design standards. It's a little different than the other ones we talked about. And the question there is, you know, whether to limit the number of row houses per grouping. I think what I'm hearing you say is limiting them to 4 per grouping in the R1, for instance, would potentially add some unnecessary costs, and you don't necessarily see the need to do that. Did I paraphrase that correctly?
Well, I mean, I still want you still want compatibility to a certain extent. You know, I don't think that 10 row houses on a lot is necessarily the best fit for all of Eugene. But I also feel that getting to affordability is something that we are striving for. So perhaps this is one that we encourage, and this is an area where near transit corridors, we could allow more per lot or more per grouping than just the 4. That's kind of what I'm thinking. I'd like to try and get there, but I definitely don't think that one size fits all for all of R1. That's just where I'm at. I don't know where the rest of the commission is.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Beeson, do you have something on design standards?
Very, very fast. I thought that this was the one exception, and I thought the recommendation was for 10. And anyway, I will say I support what Commissioner Borowski said.
Okay. I think I tracked all of that. Thank you very much. Great. We've made it through 8, 9, 10, 11, 4 of your big items, and we have 2 left before we get into the parking and incentivized discussions, which we want to definitely get to. So for special area zones, we have talked about this at previous meetings, but this is our opportunity to record where each of you are with your recommendation. And so to remind you, the project team's recommendation is to encourage And the shorthand here is to treat the whole city equitably and exempt middle housing from special area zone development and design standards. And we had provided you with a memo about this, an APG memo, Angela Planning Group memo, specifically about special area zones. So that's what we're talking about here. And let's start on this one with Commissioner Edwards.
I am very strongly in support of equity throughout the community. So, I guess I've said this in previous meetings, unless there is a very compelling reason why middle housing in particular, various forms of it, I don't see why we would look at special area zones any differently. So I am still not convinced, and so at this point in time, I'm going to stick with what I have said previously. So I'd like to see them treated equally throughout the community. Is that what
Okay, and
kind of feedback?
Yeah, and to just to clarify for me that you agree with the project team recommendation.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Beeson.
I agree with the recommendation.
Okay, maybe we'll set a record on this one. We'll see. No, okay, not. Commissioner Isaacson.
Don't say it.
You gotta say it at the end.
I jinx us every time.
I'm in favor of the staff's recommendation.
Okay, Commissioner Ramey.
Fully in favor of the recommendation. This is going to draw a lot of heat, and we'll just start at this point and go forward from here.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you. I just have a question. It'll almost be a record, but I didn't see Walnut special use area zone in here. And the question that I had is, I'm all for it everywhere, but I'm also familiar with Walnut mixed use and the form-based code that was developed there, and seeing how that was an innovative process and it seems to have worked well. Would this have any effect on somebody using the form-based code to build missing middle housing?
Jeff, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, totally. So the reason that we didn't at this time apply those changes was because the Walnut Station Special Area Zone doesn't implement a residential plan designation. So it's not required through the House bill to be changed for the middle housing code changes. And one of the reasons that we did consider that one and the way that we looked at it was because of the way that it was developed. The middle housing, applying middle housing within that area would shift the mixed use nature of that special area zone. So that's why we didn't approach it at this time, unless further directed.
Okay, so basically Walnut Station stays the way it is as form-based code, and if you could fit a missing mill, if you could fit a quad or a row house or whatever in the form-based code that exists, it would be allowable and there would be no change.
Correct.
All
right, then I am absolutely in favor of this. Thank you.
Okay, that's still a record, I'm going to say. Good job. Number 12 is done. We're cooking right along. The last one here is about affordability strategies, and this is kind of a weird one too. Basically, we're saying the project team recommendation is to encourage affordability, and that's summarized in the memo from Echo Northwest about reducing barriers to triplexes and quads, especially with parking and lot size minimum. So again, there's lots of overlap here, but in general, the project team's recommendation is to try to maximize affordability through the code by affecting those things as outlined in Echo's memo. So there's probably lots more we could say about this, but it relates to other things we're going to be talking about in just a moment. So I would like to get your general hit on supporting Echo Northwest's conclusions in their memo, starting with Commissioner Isaacson this time.
I'm in complete favor of this.
Great. Okay, Commissioner Ramey.
Well, as you said, Terry, I don't want anyone to get the impression that this conversation is about affordability in totality, because it's just so much more of it. Because for me, back to the Echo Northwest, well, actually starting with test fit, with the trial fit, what units are we developing with the standards we're proposing? Secondarily, Echo thinks it's 800 to maybe 1,000. That's in our sweet spot for affordability. And then is there any way to avoid my favorite problem, which is the tear down of the single family residence and the replacement with a fourplex, going a 4 for 1, a 4 at market rate, 1 that was affordable before we tore it down. So if there's some way to manage all of that through this idea of affordability, I'd like to get at it. And I think you mentioned it already. Portland has some ideas about maybe 1 unit. If you tear something down, what you put back, at least 1 unit has to be in the affordable range. Something along those lines, I think, could solve that tear down rebuild dilemma we're going to face. So yes, of course, I'm in favor of affordability.
Thank you. No, that's all really helpful. Like I said before, there is not yet a project team recommendation on the density bonus idea, so all of this conversation is super helpful. Thank you. Commissioner, who do we have? Beeson.
So I'm in favor of, I'm kind of just staring at your slide here. I'm definitely in favor of reducing barriers to triplex and quads. I think I'm following along in the Echo Northwest memo, and especially parking and lot size. And I'm assuming, I agree certainly with what Commissioner Ramey was saying. Also, I'm assuming we at some point here are going to talk in more detail about parking.
Yep, that's coming next.
So
Really
I'm in agreement.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Edwards.
I am in agreement, but I also, I'm in strong agreement, but I also want to point out that when you have a situation where you have a structure, single family home that is affordable because it is a tear down, having investments into that neighborhood that create then 4 housing opportunities for 4 families instead of 1 is not always necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I do understand that there's a balance there, but I also do think that like sometimes this housing is actually people don't tear down perfectly good homes and in these circumstances, and so I do think that is to a certain degree expected, but I also support the idea like our need is so dire for more units that I think that a combination of things that is healthy to happen. And so I actually don't fear that happening in occasion because it happens in specific occasions. And so I don't want to shy away from that actually being an opportunity to house 4 families instead of 1. So just putting a little perspective there. So thank you.
Great. And if it's okay, Commissioner Ramey, I'm going to ask for Commissioner Borowski's thoughts and then come back to you.
Yes, I'm for reducing barriers to triplex, quads, duplexes as well. And when it says especially parking and lot size minimums, I would also like to add in the undergrounding of utilities in neighborhoods where the house next door to it is overhead, and it would cost significant money to underground when your neighbor has overheads. So I want to make sure that that makes it into the code, that you don't have to, any new thing doesn't necessarily have to underground.
Okay, great. So an exemption from undergrounding requirements for middle housing. I hear you. I hear you. Jeff has his hand up. Is it on that point, Jeff? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to let Commissioner Borowski know that is currently within the proposal. We did write something to that effect within the undergrounding requirements.
And there it's also not just in chapter 9, it's in what, chapter 6 as well. Is there any effort to address chapter 6 on this issue as well?
Yeah, it's chapter 7 to be pedantic about it, but it's we just had a meeting that last week about this topic specifically looking at what it would take to get Chapter 7 aligned with Chapter 9. So we are talking about that as staff.
Very good, thank you. I know there's been a lot of people trying to get those lined up for quite some time, so I really appreciate that.
Great. Okay, Commissioner Ramey.
Just wanted to circle back. I think Commissioner Edwards and I are really on the same page. We're talking about creating housing here, but the distinction for me is that we're changing the rules. So we're allowing it economically feasible. It's not literally a tear down. I mean, it's not a dump. It's a building that has a certain return on investment currently. It could be a really nice 800 square foot house, right? But if you can replace it with 4 1,500 square foot houses, you're going to make a lot more money on that. And so as we go about creating middle housing, and the goal is to create middle housing, I don't want to somehow mistakenly create what we already have, which is the upper scale housing. So we're in a housing crisis at all levels, but we're particularly crunched in this middle section. And that's where even the high end now, we just hear stories all the time. You know, somebody across the street had 20 offers and got $100,000 more than their asking price. That's the high end. So I understand it. But this effort is really about creating, as we say, housing across all. If the high end's taking care of itself, I want to be sure we're kind of figuring out how to get this middle area. And so that's what worries me. It's not a tear down because it's falling down. It's a tear down because we're changing the economic rules. And as we change those rules, I just want to be sure we understand what we're doing when we do it. So that's why I keep bringing it up. And I'm going to use a different word than tear down next time.
And I'm just going to add something real quick based on what Echo Northwest said in their memo. So, and what they said to us during team meetings. So one is that you can tear down, I'll just use that term too, you can tear down a single family detached home now that's affordable and replace it with a much more expensive single family detached home. So you can already do that, you know, without changing the rules. And I think their point and some of the recommendations here are if we reduce the minimum lot size, create some opportunities for replacing, if somebody does decide to get rid of an existing single family detached home, they might be able to then replace it with 4 smaller units, which would then be more affordable than what they would replace it with otherwise, which would just be a more expensive single family detached home. So that's, I think, where they were coming from and where some of these recommendations, that's why it says particularly barriers for triplexes and quadplexes, because we're talking about reducing lot sizes for them and reducing parking requirements to allow for development of smaller units in a triplex or quadplex form that would be lower cost and potentially, you know, more affordable. So I'll just add that. I think just it's pretty nuanced discussion in their memos, but that's what they're talking about. So hopefully that's at least kind of helpful.
Thank you, Matt. And I also heard your interest, Commissioner Ramey, in the density bonus and tying that to affordability. And that's a thread that keeps coming up. So thank you for that. Great. All right, you guys, we are zooming along to, oh, one more thing on affordability. I just wanted to share this with you. This is a slide that I included in my presentation to council last night because a lot of what we're talking about came up in the middle housing outreach groups and goes beyond what we can do in the land use code. And so I shared this with the council. They had some questions about it, but the idea here is to do everything we can through the middle housing code amendments, but also look at doing some things through other city processes, such as the housing implementation pipeline process, which is underway now and will be back to council by the end of the year. So there's a variety of things on this list. I just wanted you to see it so that you know that we're thinking beyond what we can do with the middle housing code amendments. Okay, now parking, the moment you've been waiting for, unless Commissioner Borowski, you want to make a quick comment.
I just had a question on a missing middle housing tax exemption program. Is that something new from the state? I know that there's multifamily tax exemptions. Is that a new program that is tied with this bill, or what is the missing middle housing tax exemption program?
We could create something to exempt from local taxes. There's not a state enabling one for middle housing that I'm aware of at this point, but it's an idea for generally tax exemptions that we have control over. Okay, moving along to parking, and I'll remind you that Rob is with us. If there are questions about kind of the city's approach to parking and transportation demand management, like reducing the need for parking, Rob is here as a resource. And of course, we have Jeff from a code perspective, and I'll just have Matt kind of summarize what the project team's recommendation is here.
Yeah, so we thought it would be helpful, since we're all going to come back and talk about parking, to be clear about what do you require now, what's the what are the administrative rules saying in terms of minimum compliance, and what are we recommending up to this point. So I will not read everything in this table, but I'll try to kind of summarize or paraphrase it. So right now, you currently require a minimum of 1 space per unit for all of these housing types, all of these middle housing types. Somebody wants to provide more, they can, but you don't make them provide more. The minimum compliance standard in the OARs, it's 1 space per unit for duplexes, row houses, and cottage clusters. It varies for triplexes and quadplexes based on the size of the lot. So essentially, the smaller the lot, the fewer spaces required. So for triplexes, lots under 3,000 square feet, it would just be 1 space per lot, 3,000 to 49.99, 2 spaces per lot. Above that, 1 space per unit, so 3. Similar kind of situation for quadplexes in the minimum compliance, but with some variations in terms of the lot size. So essentially, for triplexes and quadplexes, the idea is that it's very difficult to fit those kind of units on smaller lots and provide much off-street parking. And so they, in those standards, reduce the number of spaces required if the lot sizes are smaller. What we've proposed up to this point is essentially, in all cases near transit, 0 spaces required. Again, if somebody wants to provide more, they can, but 0 would be required. Elsewhere, for duplexes, we're recommending 1 space per unit. For triplexes and for quadplexes, elsewhere, we're recommending you go with the minimum compliance standard in the OAR, which is still less than you're requiring now. And for row houses, same thing, 0 spaces near transit, 1 space per unit elsewhere. For cottage clusters, the recommendation is to vary the number of spaces required by size of the cottages. I actually think that top lines, yeah, I guess that's right. If the cottages are under 1,000 square feet, 0 spaces, greater than 1,000 square feet near transit, just a half average of a half a space per unit, and greater than 1,000 feet elsewhere, 1 space per unit. So those are the recommendations. And I think the conversations we've had in previous meetings have been, do we want, we want to incentivize certain things, certain types of standards, maybe height, maybe lot coverage, maybe other things, not just in areas near transit, but elsewhere. And I think the question here is, do you like what we've proposed, or do you want to lower the number of required parking spaces even more everywhere versus just near transit? So that's kind of a key question. So that's one. We'll talk about this, but then I want to take us back to the previous slide and get comments on it. So we also have talked about allowing an on-street parking credit as a way to meet the off-street requirement. And the current suggestion is allow that citywide, not just near transit. Well, near transit, we're saying don't require any. So allow it citywide, except potentially in areas where there is not a supply of on-street parking or not a good supply. So that could be developments adjacent to arterials or major collectors, adjacent to roads that are unimproved and not maintained by the city, or adjacent to roads that have a metered or timed parking restrictions. That's areas where we're talking about restricted to short-term parking, not necessarily areas where you've got some kind of neighborhood parking management program, and so but not so much on the amount of time somebody can park there. We have not worked out the details of all these. There's all kinds of questions to answer to work out the details. So think of this as a concept, and feel free to tell us what you think about some of the details, but we might not have answers for you on the details of the on-street parking credit option in particular. So Terry, I would suggest we go back to the previous slide and get comments on that, and then we can talk about the on-street parking credit.
I agree. Commissioner Edwards, you have your hand up.
I'm just actually really curious about, and I know we're not Portland or Seattle or anything. I'm just actually kind of curious about what other cities, maybe even just cities like of our size, what are their kind of parking? I like this. I like the idea of being able to mitigate with on-street parking if it's available. This is on the next slide, and I can't recall all the details, but I generally support this, removing the requirements near transit. But I am actually really curious about what other communities do.
So Matt might have some answers to that. I think Rob might have some information to share, but in general, the trend is to reduce and eliminate parking requirements nationwide. That is definitely the direction that zoning reform is going. And I think some of the rub comes with, well, we don't have the urban form to support that yet. So how do we move in that direction? How can we make our code be flexible enough to support where we want to go while recognizing the current situation? And that's what we've tried to strike with the balance proposed here. Matt or Rob, you want to add anything?
I did see an email earlier, I think from Rob, that noted that Portland, Maine actually recently updated their code to eliminate required off-street parking near transit. Portland, Oregon had previously done that. They kind of tweaked those requirements a little bit. That requirement was in place like for 15 years, but nobody took advantage of it. And then finally people started taking advantage of it, and then there was some pushback. Then they retained it for developments below a certain size, like below 20 units. They then shifted that to below 30 units. So in the city of Portland, any development with 30 or fewer units doesn't have to provide any off-street parking near transit. And I have not recently kind of looked at a survey of what other cities around Oregon, like Bend, I think, most required parking near transit. I think Bend might be an exception in terms of at least requiring less, but I'd have to take a look at that. So I don't have a great answer. Rob might have answers about other communities in the state.
Yeah, I don't know about elsewhere in Oregon. Buffalo, New York has eliminated parking requirements. I mean, we could certainly look into that and get back to you about what cities have eliminated parking requirements citywide. But I agree with Terry, it's definitely a trend.
Okay. I guess I would say that I would support the striking the balance thing, going towards that direction, if that is kind of where the recommendation lies at this point. So that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. Any other commissioners want to put their hands up, or I can call on you? Commissioner Borowski.
Well, for me, hearkening back to our earlier meeting, it seemed to me that there was quite a bit of consensus of the commission to reduce the parking requirements citywide, not just on transit corridors. How that plays out is in the details, whether it's the off-street parking credits. I think I can lean towards that. To me, I think it is going to be market driven, right? If the market there's a demand for a duplex with parking spaces, they're going to build parking spaces. It also has to do with what neighborhood of town you're living in. You know, I'm fairly familiar with two neighborhoods that are fairly parking constrained. I live in the Fairmont neighborhood, and we have parking constraints and things that bear on our parking, so that in our neighborhood, I think it would people would probably build parking things. And we would also get pushback from the neighbors if we were to do the parking credits. Another area that I was very familiar with, and it's not so much R1, but is the West University neighborhood. And West University is has no, I see people circling and circling and circling looking for parking spots, which gets away from one of our goals of reducing VMTs. But you go out to Barger and some of those areas there, and there's an abundance of on-street parking. So I think I would like to try to eliminate it, just say parking requirements, no. And if we get there by using the on-street parking credits, I think that may be the tool that we might want to try. I think it's going to be something that we would enact, and then we're going to hear and see the blowback and maybe have to adjust it in years going forward. But for me, I would lean towards reducing the parking requirements citywide.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Ramey.
Yeah, I think this is the right way to go. And Commissioner Borowski hit on the same issue I would have, which was market. Market will drive some of this, but along the lines of flexibility, this gives somebody the flexibility to do it if they want. So I'm all for it.
All right, Commissioner Isaacson.
I'm in agreement. I think the parking credit is kind of an interesting idea. I'd love to see more about it when you have something more tangible to come back to us.
Great, and Commissioner Beeson.
So I'm definitely in agreement with the recommendation, the way I'm reading it. Basically zero, no minimum requirement near transit, and then the other things you've noted that are in the kind of in the other zones. I like it a lot. I think it actually goes quite a long ways. Having said that, I have a couple of other comments. Just I have been thinking a lot about parking and trying to read about it. I don't have a list of cities, and I'm not the one to talk about it, but I definitely agree. If you get into it at all, all across the country, communities are looking at reducing these requirements and or getting away from minimum requirements at all. It's a pretty big topic. And I guess I want to agree with Commissioner Borowski, or however we were talking about it, that to the extent we can move towards not requiring it out in all zones, as opposed to just near transit, I'd like to see us try to do that. I think you have people in the community that don't drive. There are people who just don't have cars. And when I sit and think about it, and I'm probably not the one that'll make ultimate decisions on it, but there ought to be housing available out in our community without parking costs embedded in it that people ought to be able to get who don't drive. So, you know, I guess when I really think about it, I think our code really ought to allow or provide for people to construct housing that doesn't have parking. So however it is we can kind of get at that, it would be great.
Okay, thank you for all that input. I heard a lot of great input that we can come back to you with some code that provides that option of not requiring parking citywide, except for the exemptions that we listed on the screen. We have lots of details to work out, but that's why we're here, to get your general feedback and direction. We'll come back to you with some actual code proposals at the next meeting. Jeff, are there any other follow-up questions you're looking for? Or Matt, any other questions before we move on? Okay.
I think we're good. If people have any comments on what we described for the on-street credit exemptions, you know, it'd be interesting to hear that. But if you think that makes sense too, great.
Just pausing here for a minute. We're at 7:04, so we're doing great because we have one more meaty topic, And then if there's time, items from commission and staff at this meeting. Okay, I'm moving on. Development standards. So this is another table that Matt put together for our viewing pleasure, kind of comparing a bunch of lot standards, maximum height, setbacks, and lot coverage all together on this slide for all of the housing types. So Matt, go ahead and explain your magic here.
Will do. And I'll say, usually I get to give Kate the credit for things, but in this case, I take the blame because I created this table. I did make her look at it and make sure I wasn't like wrong about things, but I was the one that did it. So if you don't like it, that's my fault. So I'm going to have us read down in this table. And the point of giving you this table was just to kind of go back on some of these standards and make sure we understand what you're recommending in terms of whether we incentivize things. If we're pursuing the incentive standard, are we doing that near transit or everywhere? And just knowing what we're proposing. So I'm going to take it, I'm going to kind of read down on the table. I'm going to talk about maximum height, then I'll talk about setbacks, then I'll talk about lot coverage, and then we'll want to get some comments on those. So maximum height, this is really primarily applicable to the R1 zone, because in the R2 zone, the R2 through 4 zones, we're not really proposing any change because you're all already allowing for the height that we would propose a change to in the R1 zone. So I'm just going to say that. The other thing I would say is that the recommendations are essentially the same. The current standards and recommendations are basically the same for all housing types except cottage cluster. So what we've got here is the current standard in the R1 zone is 30 feet plus another 7 feet for a pitched roof over a certain pitch. And that standard's the same for all these middle housing types except cottage cluster. The incentive standard, which we had up to this point recommended for areas near transit, but which I think a lot of you had suggested apply kind of everywhere, would be in the R1 zone to increase that to 35 feet, from 30 to 35 feet. And then R2 to R4, no change. Again, you already allow higher heights in those areas. So that's what we've got for height. And I think what we want to find out is, should we apply that incentivized standard everywhere or just near transit? So that's one question. I'll just cover all of these and then we'll kind of go back and get your feedback on maybe all three. Setbacks, we talked about this one before. I think we know where to land on this, but we just kind of want to make sure. Right now, your front yard setbacks 10 feet, interior 5 feet. The suggestion had been, and it's the same everywhere, except it's a different kind of deal a little bit in cottage clusters. The proposal had been to reduce that to 5 feet for the front yard, keep the interior at 5 feet. We had suggested just doing that near transit for that reduction in the front yard setback. And I think what we heard from you all was do that everywhere. It's okay to do that everywhere. Finally, lot coverage. So we talked about this one earlier. This helps maybe clarify at least kind of what this current standard is and what the incentive standard is. For the plexes, the current standard is 50%. The incentivized standard had been 70% in the R1 to R2 zones. There is no lot coverage standard for the R3 and R4 zones. So this is really just, we're talking about the R1 and R2 zones. The staff recommendation early on had been keep it at 50%. But I think what we've been hearing from you is, no, we ought to bump that up at least near transit, if not everywhere. And so that's kind of like, that's what we'd like to hear. For row houses, the current standard 75%. We had not recommended any change. 75% is fairly high lot coverage. Once you figure in setbacks, et cetera, it's hard to get much above that, frankly, for row houses. So we had not recommended any change on that. And we hadn't done any test fits on row houses. We had done test fits on the plexes, and they indicated that particularly if you require less parking, you could, and you keep your setbacks, you could get above 50%. You could get to 60%, maybe 65, maybe not 70, but maybe close, depending on the size of the lot. So that's my summary of all this stuff. And we want to hear what you have to say about it. Sorry for all the talking.
No, I think that works. It's complex and things interrelate. So we're doing our best. Let's start with Commissioner Edwards.
Thank you. I'm just kind of reading through. So how do you want feedback? Do you want to just like lump sum or
I would say, why don't you tell us what you think first for maximum height, then for setbacks, then for lot coverage.
okay. So for maximum height, I definitely support the incentive standard. I mean, we're talking about a 5-foot difference in the built environment does not seem to make much of a difference, but I think in, from affordability, it would actually make a huge difference in talking to developers. That makes a big difference.
And would you do that everywhere or just near transit?
I think I would do that everywhere. I mean, because the current standard everywhere is 30. We're talking about going up 5 feet. I would support doing that height and set, an additional 5 feet. I would support that everywhere. Setbacks. That one I feel I'm not really sure. I definitely think, there's sort of a compatibility component that I think about when I think about especially the front yard 10-foot setback and what that, when you're bringing other, so incentivizing definitely along transit, that makes sense. I'm kind of torn as far as everywhere else, whether or not the 10-foot, keeping that consistent with other structures in an area. So that one, I don't know that I necessarily would support the 5-foot setback in anywhere but transit. Let's see, cottage cluster. Yeah, I mean, I support the incentive. That one is front yard 10 feet. Like that seems reasonable to me. And then I do definitely the lot coverage. I do definitely support increasing that incentive across the board. That doesn't. I don't see a reason to have it different along transit as far as anywhere else as well. So I support the incentive standard across the board. It's the setbacks that I'm a little squishy on right now, just because I just think, when a whole entire area has a 10-foot setback, I just don't know what that would look like. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
I'll let you move on.
Thanks, Commissioner Edwards. And that makes sense. I wrote down incentivize for height, incentivize for lot coverage, incentivize near transit for setback. Is that a good summary? Okay, great. Commissioner Ramey, how about you?
I'm okay with the height thing. For both the front yards and the lot coverage, I'd like to circle back on those testing these units to see what we were getting. 70 seems a little high to me. I'd be curious to see what 60 did in terms of the lot coverage. And then the front yard, excuse me, from a 5-foot to a 10-foot, I guess it's from 10 to 5. Kind of remembering the conversation we had about commercial setbacks when we were getting a little queasy about putting residences that close to a sidewalk. These are all residences. So, but to me, it's more about what we're learning from the test fits and how that's all playing out for these. So to sum it up, 5 feet front yard, maybe. And 70% seems a little high, 60% might be better. And then for the 75% row houses, I'm fine with that everywhere. And I'm fine with the cottage cluster the way it is.
Just real quick on the test fits. So I don't think any of the test fits got above 60% or maybe 62%. Now, the thing about that was we assumed your current we assumed the proposed 10-foot front setback there. So had we allowed the setback to go down, there's maybe one of those test fits that was a quadplex on a small lot that could have gone above 60. And Jeff might have something to looks like say about this one, but
Yeah, Commissioner Ramey, I just wanted to provide some context that within the R3 and R4 zones, there is, so lot coverage does not apply, but there is still a minimum open space of 20%. So that would be effectively an 80% lot coverage. So in those parts of town that are R3 and R4, you could potentially look at those as examples of where they may have built out to that level. I don't have any examples on hand, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. That's helpful, and Matt, that's helpful too. So if we're getting her in the low 60s with our test fit at a 10% front yard, and then I would leave it. I would leave it at 10 and 60. But that's just me, because again, I'm worried about how big the units are getting. So.
Okay, that's all fair. Thank you. Moving on to Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm on the, I think we can go 35 feet citywide. However, if we are going to 35 feet citywide, I would definitely stick with 10-foot front setback. If you think about it, you're gonna, if you have a 5-foot front setback, you could possibly have a 35-foot building with a pitched roof on top of that, 5 feet from the sidewalk. We're getting into the same concerns that were brought up when we had to change the commercial standards, because it went right to the lot line. If you think about it, interior is 5 feet, but that's interior is 5 feet on my lot and 5 feet on the next lot. So that was something that we talked about bringing it down to 5 feet earlier in our discussions, and I was opposed to it back then. I think especially if we're going up in height, I can't live with a 5-foot front yard setback in R1. Possibly along transit, but then again, for me, along transit means a quarter mile in, right? So a quarter mile in is quite a ways. You're getting back into the neighborhoods there as well. So I think leaving it at 10 foot and 5 foot, and then as far as lot coverage, that is, you don't have to go to 70 foot. You're allowed to go to 70%, right?
Yeah.
You're not. So for me, that's flexibility. If somebody can make it work and make the numbers work and get it at 70% lot coverage, I don't have a problem with that.
And I will note that's kind of what we heard from the developer roundtable, for what it's worth.
Yeah. So that to me gives it the flexibility that an innovative architect and design team can put together. So I'm for that, but the 10 foot is where I'm at on setbacks.
Great. Okay, I've got that down. Now, Commissioner Beeson.
So I'd go with the 35 foot throughout the city. So I agree with your all the way down the list there with the incentive. I'm a little torn on setback. So I guess I'm also assuming we're going to see this again when you bring the code amendments. We not have a discussion, but we'll get to see it again. We'll get to think about it a bit. I'm kind of in agreement with Commissioner Borowski. I think 10 feet is not very far. So I guess that when I look at it on the setbacks, I'd say 10 feet on the front and 5 feet on the interior, all the way through is what I would go for. And on lot coverage, I'm inclined to want to go 70, definitely 70 near transit and 70 in all zones. I guess I'm curious about this test fit discussion and learning a bit more about that. And if it looks like we get through that and it's more like 60, I'd be fine with that. I think if we can increase the 50 by whatever's reasonable, is what I'd be looking for.
Okay, thank you. All right, bring us home, Commissioner Isaacson.
I have questions in 22 parts. I'm fine with the 35 and 10. I don't know if I'm bleeding a dead horse with this or not, but the question I had earlier about setbacks, would this be an appropriate time to at least explore that as an option for second story or above extending out as an option for folks who have a development where it's a tighter space, and so we can only fit so much we can at the street level, but on higher ups, we can get more square footage for folks and attract a different developer, a different project. Just thoughts.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks, Commissioner Isaacson. I thought this was a good time just to bring up that not proposed as being changed with middle housing, but the Eugene Code does currently permit for setback intrusions, and those include things like balconies, front porches, bay windows, etc., to extend within those setbacks. So for front yard setbacks, it's up to 5 feet, and then on side yard setbacks, I believe it's 2 feet. And there's other qualifications and limitations there. So in regards to 2-story structures, you would be allowed to have balconies and porches that extend into the front yard setback, but not so much a expansion of the structure itself. So I wanted to add that clarification in there.
Got it. Okay.
So does that mean your support for, where are you with setbacks?
35, 10, and the 70.
And 70, okay, great. So it's the incentivized option for lot coverage. Whew, I feel like I should take a deep breath. We went through a lot of material tonight, and this is the last one. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, there's one more, right? On what side?
God. Oh God, I thought we were done.
It was a nice try, Terry. It's only 7:21.
It's only 7:21. Matt, take us through this one.
All right. So lot size, kind of the tables oriented the same way in terms of what your current standard is, what the minimum compliance standard would be, and what the incentivized standard would be. And again, I think generally the incentivized standard was proposed near transit, and but something less than, and the minimum compliance standard was proposed elsewhere. Oh, I don't think that's quite right, actually. All right, but I'll go through it and you tell us what you think makes sense, either near transit or everywhere. So for duplexes, current standard 8,000 square feet in R1. And so really all of these, we're talking about the R1 zone, not so much the other zones. And also I'll note, we already talked about row houses to some degree here. We might not need to revisit that unless you want to. So in the R1 zone, duplex, current standard 8,000, minimum compliance standard would be 4,500 square feet for the R1 through R4, and the incentivized standard would be 2,250 per lot, not per unit. Small lots, you've got a small lot standard, no change, because that would be the same as the minimum compliance standard. Triplex, the minimum compliance standard would be 5,000 square feet. The incentivized standard is 3,500 square feet. You could go somewhere between those two everywhere, but 3,500 in the, for instance, in areas near transit. Quadplex, minimum compliance standard 7,000. The incentivized standard was 4,500. And then cottage cluster, same standards there for lot size. And row house, again, we already kind of talked about, so I won't repeat that. So I think the question here is, do you like the incentivized standard either just near transit or everywhere? That's sort of one question. The other would be, if you like incentivized near transit, would you recommend anything lower than what the minimum compliance standard is elsewhere? So now I'll stop.
Okay, I've been mixing up your order here. So for this one, I'm going to start with Commissioner Isaacson.
You know, I think I'd like to hear what some of the other commissioners have to say on this one. This one's a little bit more meaty, if that's all right.
That's totally fine. Let's go on to Commissioner Ramey.
Okay, Commissioner Isaacson, I was just hoping for some time here. When I'm glancing at these are radical changes in lot sizes. So that catches my my attention right away. But having said that, I think I like the incentivize everywhere, but I don't know how you could go beyond that to to further incentivize in the transit area. So maybe lot size isn't something you incentivize in the transit area, but it's other aspects of development we're doing there. So I guess for me, I would just use the incentivized standard everywhere and look for other areas of development strategies for the transit area.
Great, and I definitely heard you before advocating for a density bonus if affordable. Okay, how about Commissioner Borowski?
Yeah, I mean, we're in the incentivizing, we're doing some significant incentivizing on the lot sizes here, going quite a bit down. So I can live with that citywide. Row houses, I can't go with no minimum lot area. I hope you heard what I said before. I think I would go the 1,500 square foot for most of R1 and 12 or 1125 transit corridors is what I would recommend on row houses. And then on the incentivized standards, if we wanted to bump that up a little bit further, what I would say is make sure that the incentivized standards include the parking variance for on-street parking near transit would be the way that I would supersize the incentives, which are already pretty large in my opinion right now.
Great, thank you. On to Commissioner Beeson.
I'm wanting the incentivized standard for everything citywide. When I was thinking about it this afternoon, and it seems to me like kind of a logical way to do it, and I couldn't really think of any good reasons why, if it was okay near transit, why it would not be okay elsewhere. So I guess unless I hear something from the city staff saying, well, gosh, we really can't do this, or which I'm assuming I'm not going to hear. I think the incentivized standard across the city for all of those is where I would land.
Okay, great. Commissioner Edwards.
I also would support the incentivized standards across the board. And I will just say that this is just creating flexibility. This isn't like, you have to build on that's a lot this small. I just think that creating the maximum amount of flexibility is a good thing. So incentivize across the board.
Great. Awesome. And again, just to remind you all and everybody watching, we're trying to get your input so we can bring you the best code recommendation. You'll have a couple bites at the apple on that in June, and then we'll go away and put it into an adoption package. So that's where we are in the process. Let me hear from Commissioner Isaacson, and then I'll come back to Commissioner Borowski.
I'm on board. There was such a significant change here. I wanted a little bit more time to plug it over, but I'm on board.
Okay, great. Commissioner Borowski.
You already heard from him.
I know, but he has his hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Blends in.
Thank you. The only thing that I wanted to say is I would hope that you would maybe run these things by Commissioner Taylor and Commissioner Fragola, because I've gained a lot of insight from both of them, but in particular, Commissioner Taylor, who works with this code all the time. And so I would love to make sure that they have an opportunity to weigh in. And if you could send us any of their, after you meet with them, if they have some notes or whatever that you'd like to share with us, I would appreciate that.
Thank you for that. We will extend that offer, and they are both resources along with Commissioner Beeson on this project. And so we have met with them several times in between your meetings for what that's worth. Commissioner Ramey, and we are out of time, so let's wrap it up soon.
Oh boy. It was just Commissioner Borowski's no minimum lot area for row houses. Again, if we're trying to create flexibility, and this is a fee simple opportunity, I'm not sure why, I missed why you were objecting to that earlier. It seemed like a good idea.
Well, the reason that I thought that, I mean, that gets to basically a density of almost 39 units per acre, which I think might get, I mean, that's above R2 as an allowable density, like almost 1.5 times what R2 is. So right now, so that's why I just thought if you did the 1,500, that puts it right at about R2's densities, and so that was my thinking behind it.
Is it possible you could limit the number of units and get the same back to the 4 versus 10 argument? Is that another way to do it? Again, it just seems like if you could buy a unit and it was on anyway.
Yeah, you can. I mean, that's the thing. Do you go density? Do you go number of units, or do you go lot size? And I thought we kind of landed that lot size was one that could get us to where we wanted to go, and that's why I proposed that.
Great. Thank you all so much for your thoughtful comments. We're right at 7:31. But you made it through everything, which I think is so fantastic. Give yourselves a pat on the back, and I thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Elizabeth. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing. I forgot to do that.
You're muted.
I was worried all meeting that I would unmute while you guys were all talking because I didn't have much to say in this meeting as you were working hard through that. But what I was trying to say is that you just had 3 pretty big weeks of 5 meetings, and including I think 2 that had extended time. So for that, we're going to give you next week off. So enjoy your week, except for the 2 of you on ETAC. And then you'll be back Planning Commission on June 7th. It's a Monday for deliberations on commercial setbacks. And then on June 8th, you have deliberations and action on the Laurel Ridge PUD. So have another appeal issue to get through and then take final action on that. And then assuming that's not going to take you all meeting, I would like to use the rest of that meeting to do some of the retreat follow-up. There were some council communication items that you guys wanted to further explore, and I wanted to be able to give you just an update on what I've been working on from what came out of there. I mentioned to Commissioner Rainey, I have a half-completed email that updates that, but haven't been able to finish it. So I think we'll aim for June 8th for that. And then middle housing will be back on June 14th. So no rest for the weary. And then if you're paying like to pay attention to what's going on with council, they have an update tomorrow, a joint meeting with LTD on moving ahead at their noon work session. So lots happening. And I think that's all I have, unless there's any questions.
Rob, it was good to see you here, and give my best to your wife.
I will, John. Thank you. Nice to see you too.
Ditto.
We miss her.
Her name's Stephanie Jennings, for those of you who don't know her, and she used to do affordable housing development for the city. I would have her come on right now, but she's taking a watercolor class at Mod Kearns Arts Center. So in your neighborhood, John.
With that, I can close the meeting. I'm just waiting for everyone else to say something, but we'll see you all next time. Thank you all.